In this week's production breakdown, we're going to talk about a composition that I wrote for usage in the TV show American Pickers. They wanted something that was kind of clanky, bluesy, Tom Waitsy sort of vibe. And to get this started, I knew that the drums were going to kind of be an important part, and the drums always are in Tom Waits music, and he likes a lot of like noisy and like almost found sounds. And the Easy Drummer has a library called Twisted Kit, which is really, really great for this. It has a lot of, you see like pots and pans, and you get stomps and claps and just all kind of different clanky things, which is really cool. Before I get too deep into that though, let's actually listen to the track. As you heard, the second 30 seconds of the song progressed a little bit more with more percussion. This is a pretty standard trick for this sort of sync licensing, that you develop a song and then just the second 30 seconds they want a little more in it, right? And so at this point I'm not adding any more melodies or anything like that, but I'm just filling it in, making it sound bigger. And I added a little more percussion. Let's start with the drum groove though, because I started talking about this a little bit before. The groove starts off with pretty clanky, right? Now, I added an additional track below it that was adding some more noise to it, and you see I labeled that one clank. Yeah, this is the part you hear at the top. Let's listen to the bass guitar. I used this UAD Ampeg plugin. Been using this a lot recently. Pretty simple. I think I just pulled up the stock setting. I have a few customized settings on here because I've been using it since I recorded this, but I didn't have any of this stuff set up. It was just very fairly basic. Into an LA2A, which I had set as following, and then at the end of the chain was this the Studer A800 plugin. That's pretty common for me to use those three plugins in conjunction. Um, the bass does make a big difference. I think you're gonna have to mess with different settings or different options depending on the bass you're playing. I really like Fender P basses for recording. I find them to be the most versatile, or at least for the music that I'm doing. I tend to use two of them. This particular recording, I used a 1971 P bass, and yeah, it does sound a little different than my more modern P. Not that my more modern P doesn't sound good. It just, I think the 71 is a little punchier in some ways, and it's not as out of control the low end. I think the new P bass is maybe it's a little girthier. Again, not better, not worse, but different. And having knowledge of your instruments, and this is kind of why I have so many different instruments. But having this knowledge can simplify things going on when you're doing a recording, and just knowing what each instrument really like delivers. I think for like a lot of this TV stuff, the thing is regarding the mixes is that you're not going to spend as much time with it as you would when you're doing a record. So anybody who makes their living from mixing records might hear some of this stuff and be like, oh, well, here's what I would do. I might do this, I might do that. But the name of the game is like you're just putting them out really quickly. So I try to make a lot of decisions that I know are going to be neutral is not the word, because I'm not necessarily looking for neutral, but I'm looking for predictability a little bit, in the sense that like I know how all these elements are going to add up together. Because for instance, like I want to be able to do one of these in like under an hour, right? Because they're royalty based, and eventually it's about how many of them you get in TV shows. And if you're spending 6 hours on a mix on one of these, it's eventually going to be really a slow process for you to earn income from them. That doesn't mean that I cut corners in the sense that I don't care or anything like that, but I try to do a lot of pre-mixing going in so that I don't have to sit and tweak for hours. There's really not much on this track, so let's talk about the guitars. Both of the guitars were cut with a 68 Gibson ES335, the original humbuckers. The 335s, I think, are really fun to record with, because the fact that they're semi-hollow, it just gives a little bit of more of a woody tone, I think, around the notes. I also use a lot of solid bodies like a Les Paul and Tele and stuff, but even like staying in the Gibson family, like an SG or a Les Paul, they're just a little bit, I think, more tight and direct sounding with the note. The 335s or any hollow, like a 330 or 335, they just have a little bit more of an aura, I think, around the note. And sometimes I use them just for that matter, especially I think when using amp sims. And I did use an amp sim for this. These guitar sounds. Let's look at what one I used. I used this vintage amp room from it's one of the UAD plugins. It's Softube makes it. If we look at the settings, this has been kind of my go-to setting when I'm using pedals. So I'm trying to get it fairly clean, and so I can plug my pedals in and use that as the basis for a tone. I find that really helps a lot, like when I can use the pedals as the front end. But the tremolo is off, and you'll notice I cranked the treble. I pulled the master volume back a lot because I really didn't want it to overdrive that much. Like these plugins, I've mentioned it in other videos, but they're pretty hyped when you open them, and I find that that's not often where I will even get an amp to be when I'm using it. So this is, I think, a little closer to what I would have some Fender amps. Definitely not a twin reverb, but maybe a deluxe or a Vibrolux or something like that. I always use the Studer A800 plugin. The only thing I do is I always turn the noise off. I don't want the noise, but everything else I just leave it stock. It's 15 IPS, and then I roll with it. It just makes everything sound better. There's a couple components to this guitar sound aside from the amp sim and the 335. I used this Effectrum tube drive pedal. I use this a lot when I use amp sims, even if I have the gain really low, because this tube's in it. It runs at amp voltage. It feels like an amp with some tube sag in it, and it really brings it to life in a way I think that it's hard to do with amp sims. And I'll often try to get like that vintage amp room pretty clean, and then if I want any sort of overdrive, I'll use it from this pedal. So I'm using this pedal to some degree as a preamp. I use it a little bit more on that. You can hear it overdriving a little bit. And the settings, I think I had the bass boost cut, and I didn't have the treble boost on. I was also using the tube drive into this Strymon El Capi stand to get a little bit of that Mark Ribot slapback echo kind of tone. I often will roll off a little bit of the high end for the guitar, especially when recording, and I didn't have much of the wow and flutter up on that one. I don't think I had it up at all. I really like this knob a lot though, and will often kind of crank it so it warbles. I changed one element in the second guitar part, which we'll hear here. If you listen to that tone, there's just something a little different about it, right? And I think that your mind would be wondering, like, is it a fuzz? Is it an overdrive? Like, how are you getting that sound? And the answer to that is I was using this Germania pedal. It's pretty much just a Rangemaster treble booster. They are really cool pedals, and they act differently than a fuzz and a distortion and an overdrive. They were used a lot in the late 60s, early 70s. Jethro Tull, Aqualung, I mean, that's a very Rangemaster heavy sound, as well as some of the early Black Sabbath records. Actually, Tony used a Rangemaster. To me, the Rangemaster has more attack. So sometimes a fuzz, it's a little soft and a little pillowy, and overdrive is just a little too sharp. I kind of think the treble booster can, as far as your attack goes, can do a couple interesting things. Like it's fuzzy, but it still has a little bit of a stronger attack. I use this in front of the tube drive pedal because really what a Rangemaster does is it's like a booster pedal, but it's just not a clean boost. It does add some frequencies and harmonics and some distortion, but it's designed to just really slam the front end of your amp. Now, this doesn't really work so well with digital recording because your converters aren't going to like that, right? They're not a valve amp, so they're going to freak out if you start hitting it. And this can, I think, add up to at least 20 dB of gain, which is not a good combination. So to get around that, I use the tube drive pedal after this treble boost because that is going to act as a valve amp because it does have valves in it. So I cranked this up pretty good. It was hitting it pretty hard. Now I turned the gain almost all the way down on the tube drive because I didn't want a lot of overdrive coming from the tube drive pedal, even though that's what was going to happen, but I didn't want to add a lot more. So this is kind of just slamming it, and it acts, I think, a lot like kind of how Jethro Tull was getting those sounds, like with the Rangemaster and the treble booster. There are a couple companies that make them. This guy is not making these anymore, but if you look up a lot of Rangemaster clones, or there's companies that make like exact replicas of them. It's kind of a really cool flavor to have in your tone logger. Last thing I added to counter that lead guitar part, the treble booster part that we just heard, was I added like an organ, a Farfisa organ. That's it. Very simple production. Doesn't need a lot of elements, as often these type of cues are in the background, so the fact that they're not super busy is actually better and less distracting.